Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started for the evening. Welcome, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Bella Gerlich, and I'm the Dean of Libraries here. Welcome. It's a good place to be outside of the cold, I'm guessing. We are very excited to have Dr. Jasmine Parker here with us tonight as part of Black History Month. We also have an exhibit featured in these three cases here, courtesy of the Lubbock Roots Historical Arts Council. And upstairs in the third floor, Dean's Gallery, has some larger pieces of artwork also on loan. You can go up and see them after the presentation tonight. Now on to the program. Dr. Jasmine J.D. Parker is a trained interdisciplinary historian whose research expertise intersects the fields of education, law, and sociology. Her work highlights historical, legal, and socio-political paradigm shifts as it relates to the 20th century American civil rights movement, generally, and schooling particularly. She is the creator and organizer of Race, Racism, and Public Spaces, a series that is currently sweeping Texas Tech University. She currently serves as dissertation coach in Texas Tech's College of Education, as a teaching faculty member in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and as a part-time faculty member in the university's Honors College. Dr. Parker earned her Ph.D. in History of Education in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a Master of Arts in Social Sciences and Education Policy from the Department of Educational Policy Studies, also from the University of Illinois, and a BA in History with a minor in Sociology from Prairie View A&M. She obtained legal training as a law student at Indiana University Bloomington, Morrow School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Dr. J.D. Parker.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It is wonderful to be here this evening to talk about something that I read and discuss all the time, which is about race relations, social activism, and litigation. In order to talk about race relations and social activism, we really need to discuss why they both work together, how both things pair well with each other, and why you cannot have social movements, particularly as they relate to civil rights progress, without having social activists in the streets and also having litigation and suits filed in the courts. So at this time, I'm going to give you a brief timeline about civil rights. And I'm going to do this off of my head, and I will rely on notes as needed. So to start talking about civil rights in America, we really need to talk about slavery. Because civil rights, can I take this off? Okay. I'm a walker, excuse me. I'm not a lectern person. So I'm just going to briefly, before I discuss civil rights, I'm going to read something that is applicable not just to the Black experience, not just to the woman experience, but to civil rights in America. A woman whose birthday is today, Audre Lorde. I believe Audre Lorde would have been 88 years old today. So I'm going to read an excerpt from her speech that was delivered in Chicago in 1977. The speech is titled, "The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action." Audre Lorde said, "I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood, that the speaking profits me beyond any other effect. What I most regretted were my silences. And I began to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it is most desirable not to be afraid, Learning to put fear into a perspective gave me great strength. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. That is an excerpt from Audre Lorde. I read that because Black people, I'm just going to leave this on the floor. Black people as a group have been oppressed, have been made to feel less than, and have had their skill set exploited for centuries, absolutely for centuries. And with that exploitation came one of the 5 types of oppression, which is silencing. And with silencing, a lot of people endure great pain. Some people triumph, some people overcome adversities, but a lot of people remain silent and they don't want to speak out about what's happening to them, what's happening in their communities, and what they are going through. Civil rights activists, some were silenced in the beginning, like Rosa Parks, who decided not to give up her seat after the brutalization of Emmett Till. Some people were silenced, some people were called to action. Some people utilized their skill set or turned to legality to argue, which is another form of social activism. And so what I'm going to do is break down why these arrows are facing one another, because you have to have civil litigation in order to make change stick, but you have to have people in the streets arguing for social activism work around equity and around equality. I'm a hands-on person, so at any time you have a question, just stop and ask. I like more community-based discussion than lectures and talks, if you will. So if I go too fast at any time, just let me know to slow down, okay? Okay, so starting with slavery, I'm sure a lot of you know that this year marks the 400th anniversary of the first documented slaves on the shores of Virginia, 1619. What a lot of people don't realize is that slavery actually started a century before that in America. So you have the first African slaves arriving with the Spanish, with Portuguese people in 1525 to build a Spanish trade port. Those slaves used their activism, their language, their bodies to physically, to verbally rebel against those Spanish traders. And they demolished the port the same year, 1525, which is why a lot of people don't know that. So you have slavery and slaves coming, the enslaved people coming to America in 1525. But you also, at the same time, had free African people here in America in 1500. Just like you had free people who were indigenous, native people here, you had free Asian American people here in the 1500s. Well, the activism started in 1525 with the demolishing of that first trading port. From there, you have the original founding of slavery in 1619, as you all know. But then you also have different laws that are now getting on the books, because while you have slavery going on and you have people who were trying to overtake the new slave owners on the ships before they made it to the shores of Virginia and other places in the United States, you also have a lot of people who are saying, I'm not going to live as a slave. So, of course, you have people who decided to jump over the ship and commit suicide because they would rather die than be a slave. You have people who did not eat. They died of malnutrition, some of them by will because they would rather die instead of being a slave. And those are forms of activism of revolving and revolting against the system that was now put on them. So when you think about Black lives and do they matter, I beg people to question not the contemporary sense of does the Black Lives Matter movement matter, but more so, do black lives as human beings, do they matter? You're going to see images that perpetuate and are recycled over time. They may look different, but they're the same exact thing. And this started with slavery. So now we know that we have slavery in the 1500s and the 1600s. And with that, you have different acts and different laws that are being passed, like the Fugitive Slave Act, because you have people who were formerly enslaved who decided that they wanted to seek quote-unquote freedom. Now, I say quote-unquote freedom because freedom, to me, when you think about freedom and democracy, black people today still are not free. So when you think about freedom, and we hear freedom, home of the brave, land of the free, you're shaking your head. It's not really true in the sense of when you think of everyone in America who is free, the freest people of all are white men, then white women. The most bonded and chained group in America are black people. The most relegated group in America, an unprotected class of people in America, is the black woman. So when we go through these slides and videos, I want you to have that lens because I want you to really think about your own experiences of what does freedom mean to you. And I'm going to explain why black people technically are not free today. And I'm going to use case law to back this up. So again, you have the Fugitive Slave Act of the 1700s. You have the Civil War that is about to happen in the 1800s. Of course, you know that slavery technically ended in 1865 in Texas, 1867, thanks to Union soldiers not arriving in Texas until 1867 to declare Texas enslaved persons free. But at the same time, as soon as the Civil War ended in 1865, you have the immediate creation and founding of the Ku Klux Klan, also in 1865. So you have Ku Klux Klan members who were literally hunting down black people and killing them and lynching them. You have different black people who wanted to have the government to just acknowledge that black life meant something. So you have the founding a few decades later of the NAACP in 1909. You have Ida B. Wells, one of the co-founders, who asked the federal government to promote a bill, an anti-lynching bill. That did not happen. We have 2019 where that's about to go through, hopefully in Congress. So you have a lot of different things that have happened over decades. And what I'm going to do is explain some of this with images. So this is an image of, am I not a man and a brother? I'm going to take a second so you can look at this and particularly pay attention to the verbiage. Have any of you seen these words before? Where? Where have you seen them? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Sanitation, the sanitation workers. Yep, you're right. So you're both right because, again, slavery, and this was a slave who was pleading, am I not a man and a brother? You can attribute this to Frederick Douglass's writing, What Does the 4th of July Mean to the Negro? You can attribute this to Ida B. Wells, anti-lynching, because slavery is just an elongated lynching of black people. So you have images like this that really want you to question, do black lives matter? When you look at images of am I not a man and a brother, This is a cry out of please acknowledge my personhood. Please acknowledge my basic humanity and my right to live and breathe just like every other person. And this will continue for decades. The argument will take different forms. It will take forms in schooling. It'll look different with voting. Will you acknowledge my citizenship? Can I vote? Can I go to school? Can I have the same resources as every other child, be it a white child, an affluent white child, or a poor white child? I want resources. I want textbooks. I want a school. I would like to go sit down at a restaurant. All of the cries of what black people should have and what black people as a group should have access to, it all boils down to humanity, acknowledging basic humanity, living, breathing people who are people and not property, people who have consciences and intellect and language and communication and are traveled and are cultured just like everyone else. So I'm going to allow you to read this passage just for a second, and then I'm going to talk about the DoubleV campaign. Now, the DoubleV campaign was not the first campaign. It was not the first quest for black people to get access to anything, to any sphere in American society. You have court cases that started with the Dred Scott case of acknowledging that a person who moved to a free state was no longer enslaved and therefore should be a citizen. You have the very first school desegregation case in American society, which was Roberts versus Boston, 1849. You have Plessy versus Ferguson, which created the one-drop rule of if you have one drop black blood in you, you are black. Therefore, you should be separate and inferior rather than separate but equal. So you have all these different cases and all of these different movements with the court system. You have Sarah Roberts being a 5-6-year-old little girl whose dad sued so that Sarah could get access to her neighboring Boston public school, and the city of Boston denied her claim. In the city of Boston, black people should not have been educated at all. So while the entire state of Massachusetts outlawed slavery in the 1700s, and then desegregated their entire state, the only city that remained segregated was Boston. And Boston school children who were black could not go to school. So Bostonian black parents all pooled their funds together to pay for a schoolmaster, which is a teacher, so that black school children in Boston could get educated. So you have that activism socially of saying, let's get our money together so that we can educate our children. And then you have that litigation claim of Sarah Roberts versus Boston in 1849 to create public schooling for black children in the city of Boston. And when the court case was decided, the judges ruled that for Boston, for Sarah Roberts versus Boston, that black children did not need access to public schools that were the same as white children's schools. So the ruling was that black children had to go to segregated schools in Boston, but the city would go ahead and develop and create public schools for black children in Boston. City members revolted against the court's desegregation, their segregation remedy, which was creating actual black schools for black children because they previously had none. And by 1855, the city committee decided to overturn the court ruling. So then in 1855, Boston had desegregated schools. Yeah. Boston had desegregated schools. So you had the social activism, you had the court decision. The city did not like the court decision. So a few years later, about 5.5 years later, the city desegregated. But the legal precedent on paper was that Boston needed segregated schools. So, because of that, the legal precedent that the Supreme Court used to argue for Plessy versus Ferguson was the city of Boston. Sarah Roberts versus Boston. And a lot of people don't realize, well, what does a train car case have to do with a public school case? Because Homer Plessy was just trying to ride the train in New Orleans, and being 7/8 Creole white, he could pass for white, but being 1/8 Negro, he could pass so well that the clerk who sold him his ticket did not realize he was not white. And so Plessy had to make it known the second time he bought a ticket that he was not white, and then he consciously went to sit in the whites-only section. He would be called, per our federal government likes to call them, a disruptor. So as a disruptor, that's how you have the case Plessy versus Ferguson. And when the Supreme Court ruled, rather than saying that, well, according to the 14th Amendment, which grants everyone, especially people who were formerly enslaved, citizenship and equal protection of the law, equal access to life, liberty, and property, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was constitutional per Sarah Roberts versus Boston, 1849. So you have social activists who are constantly attempting to undo legislation that's on the books because our laws are racist. That's why you have to have social activism in order to propel civil rights forward. So when you think about the DoubleV campaign that's here on this screen, you have a black-owned newspaper in Pittsburgh that argued for DoubleV, victory abroad and victory at home. This was during World War II. So the argument was that if black soldiers were in the war and they were all over Europe and other places fighting on behalf of democracy, which in America, democracy is a synonym for freedom, then why can't black soldiers vote? Why can't black people vote? We have it on the books, right? We have the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in 1865. We have the 14th Amendment that granted the formerly enslaved citizenship in 1868. Then you have the 15th Amendment that granted black men the right to vote in 1870. So why on earth do we need a DoubleV campaign and a social movement to grant people access to what they're supposed to already have, voting rights? Well, because we know how social structures work in society. We know how systemic racism is perpetuated, and we know that in America we have institutional racism. It's embedded within our laws. It's embedded within our organizations and our companies, and the federal government is no different. So with the DoubleV campaign, you have other nuances that are going on. You have people saying, if I am a human because of the war, I should be a human in a day-to-day society. If you're acknowledging that I am a man because you are either drafting me or I'm enlisting in the war, then surely you should be able to humanize my lived experience, my life, and my livelihood in America. But that wasn't the case. So while some people had access to voting polls, overwhelmingly, black people could not vote. And it wasn't just in places like Mississippi where 3% of registered voters could vote. It was massive voter oppression in American society. You had literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, constitution test. And even if you pass the literacy test, the constitution test, whoever that registrar, the voting clerk was, they could decide whether you passed or failed. And 9 times out of 10, they decided that you failed. It did not matter if you were a dentist, which happened, where a dentist went and argued that he was a dentist. He had an advanced degree. Surely he was literate enough to pass the Constitution test and a literacy exam, but he still could not vote. He still was unregistered, and he attempted several times to vote. So you have different voter suppression laws like that, and you also see those today. And we'll talk about that at the end of this presentation, why you have to continue having social movements. You have to continue having people filing court cases and legal grievances to get some type of relief of court. You have to have people in the streets arguing, because the arguing is really just acknowledgement of, am I not a human being? Should I not have access to the same thing that white people have access to? Because who said white people were superior besides white people? What kind of litmus test is that? It's subjective, and it's rigged from the start. So when you think about the DoubleV campaign, you have different litigation that came out of that, whether it was legislation passed by Congress or whether it was people arguing in the streets who were protesting, who were boycotting, who were making their voices heard, who were talking to their representatives. But again, these are black people. So black people don't really have representatives in Congress in the 1960s. The most black congressmen actually were in the Reconstruction era, right after slavery. So in the 1960s, you don't have black representation. You also don't have representation to the fact of, or to the extent of saying, let me call a rep so I can argue why black people are systemically oppressed with voting, so that while my county may have a high percentage of black voters, other counties don't. You don't have that either. There's nothing like saying, let me call Eddie Bernice Johnson in Dallas, Texas, who is one of my congresswomen, and saying, you know, people in Georgia have massive voter oppression, and the clerk who was over that governorship election should not have been, because it's a conflict of interest. You can't raise issues like that in the 60s because you have no pathway to access. So when talking about the DoubleV campaign and activism, the campaign was about victory abroad and victory at home. Well, what does that mean? It's not just voting. It's about victory of acknowledging basic human rights. So you have black women like Ella Baker. Ella Baker was a part of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which was Dr. King's organization. And she left in order to co-found Snick, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It started in February 1960. Snick is known because while we have people like former Attorney General Eric Holder, who is a member of Snick, Snick actually was the college organization where it was created mostly of college students. They organized and they initially met at Bennett College. And then you had North Carolina A&T students, members of historical black colleges and universities, who organized, who trained, went through gruesome trainings in order to desegregate restaurant counters and counters at different stores like Walgreens, when Walgreens would have a lunch counter. The Zodiac Room at Neiman Marcus, they helped to desegregate that space as well. So Snick members, which were college students, desegregated most of restaurants in America, especially along the Mason-Dixon line. So with the Mason-Dixon line, you have southern states, all southern states, which were formerly members of the Confederate when states left to organize around upholding slavery. So you have Ella Baker, who helped to co-found Snick. And with Snick, not only were students organizing in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the first sit-in happened at Woolworths, but you have people who organize in Dallas, Texas. You have the youth council advisor, Juanita Craft, who organized teenagers, who organized white SMU students to be allies in order to desegregate the State Fair of Texas with protests and sit-ins and marches, to desegregate the Majestic Theater, to desegregate the Walgreens lunch counter. But you also have other activists who utilized their social capital and their education, like Eddie Bernice Johnson, who is the first nurse in Congress, who went downtown in Dallas to just buy a hat, a church hat, so that she could ride a train and get back to Indiana to attend a wedding. And she was turned away. She couldn't buy her hat. And of course, the sales clerk told her that she needed to go home and measure her head and mail in her measured head. So mail in her measurings of her head in order to purchase a hat through the catalog. And Eddie Bernice Johnson's parents told her it did not matter how much money you make or how much money you have or do not have. If you are well-dressed, people will respect you. Well, because Eddie Bernice Johnson was turned away and she could not buy her hat, she decided to boycott that store. And most people don't know, but that is how Dallas initiated protests, boycotts, and sit-ins at retail stores. And that is how Dallas desegregated their retail stores from that one church hat that Eddie Bernice Johnson could not try on. So you have women who are helping to pave the way by being social activists, and it's creating institutional change on its face, because you still have voter harassment, you have voter oppression, you have people who don't wait on you at restaurants still, you have people who don't want to help you in retail stores still. They are desegregated on the outside. You have people who harass or follow you in the stores still. But the institutional change occurred because of that boycott, the protests, the sit-ins. And then you have other activists like the Big Six, Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, Hosea Williams, William Young, Andrew Young, Baynard Rustin. You have all of the prolific leaders of the civil rights movement at the heads of their different organizations, be it the NAACP, founded in 1909, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Congress of Racial Equality. You have a lot of organizations that were founded in order to push forth change. The NAACP is one of my favorites to highlight, not because it is politically correct and it is the most accepted social group, social organization in American society, but because the NAACP was actually pioneering a way for not just social activism, but legal activism. The NAACP was one organization founded in 1909 by Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary Oliver, and a couple of other founders. It was a multiracial organization. Because the NAACP, for those who don't know, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, because it was founded with the mission of helping to dismantle institutional discrimination that was felt and most experienced by Black people based on white superiority, the organization just got too big. And when it got too big, and by big I mean too successful in the eyes of white America, you have governmental officials who called for the demolishing, the dismantling, the dissolving of the NAACP, because it was seen as a threat, a nonviolent threat, but a threat to status quo. And when I say status quo, I mean literally what everyone else means when they hear status quo, which is really white male success. So, with the threatening of status quo, the NAACP under attack. So it wasn't until around the 1950s that the NAACP developed the Legal Defense Fund. The Legal Defense Fund is what initiated almost every landmark decision in our courts to this day. So you have Charles Hamilton Houston, who studied at Harvard Law and went on to become a professor at Howard Law. He taught his mentee, who was Thurgood Marshall, who later became our first black Supreme Court justice. Thurgood Marshall is who consolidated those, are you okay? Who consolidated those pivotal civil rights cases, and particularly Brown versus Board of Education, to desegregate public schools in America. So you have Thurgood Marshall, you have Charles Hamilton Houston, who were not on the front lines picketing, who were not saying, let's protest XYZ stores, while you have people like Rosa Parks helping to initiate the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 after the brutal murder of Emmett Till. But you have people like Thurgood Marshall, whose early 1950s is in the courts arguing, saying we need to desegregate. We need to have more voter access on behalf of Black America. We need to have access to voting polls. We should have access to residential neighborhoods that a lot of white people have access to, regardless of racial covenants. Do you have a question?
Yes, I was just going to ask, how did the government and their reactionary lapdogs react to, or how did COINTELPRO play into the civil rights movement?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But that's a good question, because when I mentioned that the government was upset about the vast success of the NAACP, COINTELPRO had not yet been established. COINTELPRO stands for a counterintelligence program that was instituted under the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover helped to found the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover, by the way, was very paranoid. Crazy, absolutely. So with the NAACP, the threat was we're going to dismantle the organization. And the assumption, because with the threat was we will dismantle the organization if you cannot show tax documents, which, you know, some people decide they don't want to show tax documents in society today. But the assumption was that the NAACP would not be able to come up with these tax documents, their tax filings. And so that's how the Legal Defense Fund was created, because legally and fiscally, the monies for those court cases had to be separate from the organization. So you have Charles Hamilton Houston, who gave his life, he died of a heart attack in his 50s, fighting in the court system for social equity, for change, for progress on behalf of Black people. Thurgood Marshall, that was early 1950s. Early 1950s, and you have Brown, 1954. Charles Hamilton Houston passed away, I believe, 1953 or 52. So then you have Thurgood Marshall, his mentee, arguing before the Supreme Court on behalf of not just Linda Brown, 6-year-old Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas, but arguing on behalf of all Black children to have equal access to public schools, to have desegregated schooling spaces, and using social scientists' work like Mamie Clark, the wife of Kenneth Clark. I know we hear Kenneth Clark a lot in the famous doll test, which doll is nice, which doll is ignorant. His work actually was undergirded by the thesis work of his wife, Mamie Clark. So when you think about Mamie Clark's pivotal role in helping to dismantle public school segregation in America, you really have to think about what went into that. She did a lot of work with her advanced degree of looking not just at how Black children learn, but how inferior are the spaces really? And why are they so inferior? Why is there a one room for Black children with one teacher, people in all grade levels, where children and students, and by students, I mean adult age learners and young children, take shifts to learn. Young children would go in the daytime, adult learners in the afternoon. Why was it that in the South you had a lot of Black people who would say, even in the 1960s, that they didn't go past a 6th grade education or perhaps an 8th grade education. And it was because high school was not available. High school was not open. They didn't have one that existed for a lot of black people at the time. Or if there was a black school, it may have been in the city where some people still lived in rural communities and they could not commute because there were not school buses available for black children. So when you think about the deep inequity, Mamie Clark looked at all of those different aspects, and her husband undergirded with arguing that black children suffered a psychological detriment because society was telling them that they were not worthy. They were not enough. They did not have value, therefore they were not humanized. Again, that am I a man? Am I not a man and a brother? They were not humanized to the extent where they were seen as valued enough to even need a school or a school bus or even more than one teacher or a book that was not 4 generations old that was thrown out by white schools. So you have all of these different nuances that are in play, not just, well, black schools need to have the same thing as white schools. Black children should have the same opportunity as white children. But why does society vilify black people just because they exist? Mm-hmm.
And his friends and the people they were working with, and at the same time, the government becomes very concerned about the letter that he wrote to the UN and trying to coin this as a human rights. If you would speak to that.
Yeah, I personally believe that civil rights are human rights. Because in American society, when we hear arguments about civil rights and liberties, the bedrock of that is humanity. The bedrock of it is human rights. And Du Bois argued essentially the same thing centuries ago, talking about human rights and civil rights. And you have the United Nations who was upset about it. But again, it was because they wanted to protect the status quo. And in our Constitution, you don't have mentions of human rights and liberties for all people. You have different amendments that were created because of the dehumanizing of entire groups of people. So you have the 14th Amendment that explicitly talks about persons previously enslaved, which is a dehumanizing factor and a dehumanizing method to ensure that people remain systematically oppressed, devalued, and really just stripped of all personhood. And so within our 14th Amendment, it calls for citizenship rights on behalf of the previously enslaved. And Du Bois was arguing with the United Nations that human rights are civil rights. We need to move further than just talking about civil rights and talking about black oppression specifically. And we need to talk about human rights for all people and what it means to be a human being, what it means to have access, what it means to be free. And whether you look at different philosophers of the time like Du Bois and his talking about double consciousness, wearing the veil, and what that means to be both black and American in society, you have other people who were writing essentially the same thing. It just wasn't as articulated in the same way. So you have Frederick Douglass talking about what does the 4th of July mean to me? Because the 4th of July really talks about freedom and democracy, but I'm not free as a black person. And you have those different cries over the centuries, even with the Black Lives Matter movement, which we know was created out of repeated occurrences of video camera filmed police brutality, which the police brutality is nothing new because it's been happening for centuries. And that also goes back to the journalist Ida B. Wells arguing for anti-lynching laws.
Do you think that people who are supporting the Blue Lives Matter movement have a protect us, therefore, there's no doubt we should like them.
You know, I would like to answer that at the end of the presentation, but I will go ahead and answer it now because I'm not really going in a chronological order, and I've skipped a lot of different cases anyway. I can't say what people who argue Blue Lives Matter really mean because I have never in my life argued that and never will argue for Blue Lives Mattering. I believe that all human life matters, but the Black Lives Matter movement is not about other people's lives mattering more, because what people do when they say things like that is going back to slavery, which is why I always start every argument with slavery. What they're doing, saying, no, 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 my life matters more. Police officers matter more. When really a police officer's job is only to enforce the law. They do not make laws. They do not break laws. Their only job is to enforce the law. Some police officers like to take that law in their hand and think that they're really wielding that power. And then they hate when they come across an educated person, especially if they are Black, because we are their worst enemy. But Blue Lives Mattering really is a non-starter. It's a non-existent argument that people have given legs to actually make valid. But it really is not a valid argument. A valid argument in America is Black Lives Matter, because for centuries, America has told Black people that their life does not matter. And that's the only life in America that has been told that their life does not matter. White people's lives have mattered forever. White men with property lives have mattered first. Then white men without property who could pull themselves up by their bootstraps and have some type of meritocracy, their lives mattered more than white women's lives, because white women, their life only mattered to the extent of their husband's or their children's success. Then after that, you have other people who are racially white but are people of color, like Latin American people, whose life mattered because they were never told that their life did not matter. Then you have indigenous people whose life mattered as long as they did not step outside the line of what they should and should not do or be, or who they should not be. So they had access to schools, although those schools were boarding schools that dehumanized them but kept their life alive. But Black people literally lost their lives. They lost their lives every day. They were lynched, they were shot, they were killed, they were hung, they were all types of things. So Black people's lives in America are the only lives who have been told that they don't matter, which is why you have Black Lives Matter.
I was on a diversity committee once, and one of the men next to me said, the most discriminated people are white men. And so I said, yeah, that's why when you look in Congress or presidencies or all these kinds of things, you see nothing but Black lesbians, lesbians, atheist lesbians of color. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I mean Protestant straight white men. And to understand that, I always said people don't understand blind spots. And just because we're better doesn't mean you're good.
Well, and we don't know. Right, and we don't know who's better, because some person made that test, and they made it from a subjective standpoint. So just today, Politico published an article, and I'm trying to get the headline exactly right, but it was something to the extent of Joe Biden's picture and what does it mean as a white male to run for president. Now, we've had 44 white male presidents, but the article was talking about what does it mean today as a white male to run for president. The subtext within that context is that there are so many Black people running for president. And we just had a black president no less than 3 years ago. So now the white male image of what it used to mean to be president, because it was an automatic white male role, now it's under attack. Now it's under, what are we going to do? So you have these different images, but it's the same argument. It's the same argument over centuries. And the essential argument is just that black people want their lives acknowledged and respected and not threatened every day by life or death. And white people want, as a group, say, no, 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 we want control and power. And as a group, white people's method to rely and really make sure that they maintain that power is to oppress other people. And their primary target of oppression are black people. So in order to maintain power and control, white people create institutional biases, which help to perpetuate things like implicit biases and covert racism. But really, the overt of that is legislation. They are policies. They are legal acts of saying this is what you can and cannot do. Different ordinances. This is what you can and cannot do. This is where you can and cannot go. Because even when you have that legislation and when you have those ordinances or acts, they're still, in a way, they're temporary, but they're also granting you permission because the people who wrote them are overwhelmingly white. And in the language, the language looks nice. Okay, black people have access to this, this, and this. People of color have access to this, this, and this. But the other argument that's not articulated is we are allowing you access to this. We are allowing you access to this place. We are allowing you to vote. We're giving you permission to go to the store. We are giving you permission to drive down the street. We are giving you permission to go to school. So it's still about power and control. It's very nuanced. It's very layered, and it's extremely subconscious, but it's there. Which is why racism is rooted in the law, and you have to look at our laws in order to better understand from a broader context why we have societal disconnect, why we have societal arguments, why some people think now we live post-racially and other people know better. So I have a short clip for you to watch from a 1962 case of Meredith and Ole Miss. For those of you who were not alive or do not remember Ole Miss, there were riots that happened and 2 people lost their lives because of the riot. But this is not new. You have other cases. And forgive me, I highlighted a lot of school stuff because I'm an intersectional historian, history of education. But you have a lot of cases that were happening. You know, the first school case, again, 1849, Boston. You have Sarah Roberts versus Boston. Then you have Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. You know, civil rights movement did not start with Brown versus Board. I know a lot of people think that 1954 was it, but it was not. You have a long civil rights movement that started really the late 19-teens, 1920s. And a lot of that was about anti-lynchings. But then you still have a lot of nuanced cases with schooling. You have Herman Sweat versus Painter in Texas, which was about accessing the University of Texas Law School in 1950. And the Supreme Court of Texas ruled that desegregated law schools was what was best because we have Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal doctrine. Brown versus Board had not yet happened. And so for Texas, with Sweat versus Painter, you have the creation of an all-black law school, which is the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern. Well, when the court originally ruled on Herman Sweat versus Painter, the law school was actually housed in an inferior space, which was the basement at Prairie View A&M University. And then it moved to Houston, to Texas Southern University. You have other cases outside of the Meredith case. You have cases in Missouri. You have cases in Arkansas. But Arkansas, you actually have federal activation of the National Guard because Eisenhower felt like it was a bad look, and that's really what that was, in 1957, right after Brown versus Board of Education. You have Central High School attempting to desegregate, and Governor Farbus did not want to desegregate the schools. So what happened? You had a lot of rioters who were white people who wanted to prohibit those Little Rock nine black children from attending Central High School. And so eventually the National Guard was called in on behalf of the protection of the black students, because originally when they were called in, it was not that. The National Guard helped to prohibit access to Central High School. So eventually those 9 black high school students went to Central High School. Not all of them graduated because the torture was too much. You can read about some of that in Warriors Don't Cry, which is a phenomenal book. But in addition to that, you have Governor Farbus coming back after that school year and literally closing the school for 2 years. The school district closed down. There was no school for 2 years because it was better to close down than to educate all children together in one space. So the Meredith case is not the first case for higher education or for education, because you have all these other cases. At the same time, you have people flooding the streets. You have people protesting. You have people boycotting, people sitting in, people doing freedom rides, Freedom Summer to register people to vote. You have people who are losing their lives because the Ku Klux Klan are literally publishing people's addresses in the newspaper. People are bombing people's houses. It didn't happen in places outside of Texas, and Texas was exempt. Texas was not exempt. You have bombings, residential bombings in Dallas at the same time, where middle-class black people did not want to live in the bottom, which was the bottom of the Trinity River, because legally Dallas was a de jure, meaning segregated by law city. And so people who had a little bit of income, who happened to be black, did not want to live in outhouses, did not want to live in shotgun houses, or use the restroom in the middle of the street, which is what happened, the same place where they would get their water, because the city did not send plumbing, did not send plumbers, did not build equitable and adequate housing for black people in Dallas. So when those middle-class black people wanted to move to better neighborhoods, they would move to the edge of South Dallas, and their homes were bombed. So you have these things going on at the same time as litigation. Question?
Thankfully nowadays, it's the KKK and the neo-Nazis getting their address published and bombed.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that, because you have extremists everywhere, and you still have different organizations, federal organizations, that do survey. They do surveillance on different people because they think that they are a threat, because they think they are extremists. You can learn about that in a Netflix documentary on Black Lives Matter, how the founders of Black Lives Matter are being surveyed, and it's just like COINTELPRO. Can you play that clip, please? Thanks.
James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi, ending one chapter in the federal government's efforts to desegregate the university. The town of Oxford is an armed camp, following riots that accompanied the registration of the first Negro in the university's 118-year history. Much of this film record was destroyed when our cameraman, Gordon Yoder, was attacked, but he did salvage pictures of Governor Ross Barnett at the scene. The governor fought the court order long and bitterly before modifying his stand, saying Mississippi was overpowered by the federal government. President Kennedy appealed to the students and to the people of the state to comply peacefully with the law and bring the crisis to an end. Even as he talked, riots were breaking out in Oxford.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For in a government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors.
Nearly 6,000 troops patrol Oxford to maintain order, and arrests mount to more than 200 as smaller disturbances erupt the next day. Former Major General Edwin Walker, who came here from his home in Texas, is put under arrest and held in high bail on charges of inciting insurrection. He was flown to a federal prison hospital as relative calm settled on the town in the greatest crisis the South has faced since the Civil War.
What are your thoughts about that?
We're still fighting the Civil War 100 years later.
Right. Yeah. Anyone else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's very unfortunate. James Meredith actually served in the U.S. military, defending the so-called U.S. democracy and freedom. It's very unfortunate. James Meredith fought in the U.S. military defending the so-called democracy, comes back here. He's just trying to go to school, and the entire government apparatus is being used to stop him from just going to school. The whole state government, the whole federal government, I mean, it's a shame.
And you know, what's interesting is that James Meredith was listening to President Kennedy give a speech, and he felt like his speech was talking about democracy, and surely democracy was for everyone, and he wanted to access Ole Miss's school, to go to school. But that wasn't the case. As the gentleman said, 100 years later, we were still fighting the Civil War, and we still are fighting the Civil War. The Civil War never ended. It looks different, but it never actually ended. It continues today. So in 1962, you have calls for people to access schools. You have calls for people to access voting booths, to access neighborhoods that did not have racial covenants, that did not have ordinances saying that this is a whites-only neighborhood and black people are not allowed. You have all of these different things that are going on, but you also have organizers like Dr. King and the other Big Six organizations that were saying, let's strategize, let's come together and make fiscal plans, use our monies, use our intelligence to strategize and pull together in order to bring about social change. So you have people putting their physical bodies on the line in order to move litigation forward, in order to push the government to actually make a stand and not say things like, we're only here to enforce the law and we're not going to actually mention anyone's or any group's particular livelihood. So you have marchers marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to get access to voting rights. You have Mississippians like Fannie Lou Hamer who are talking to people in Congress about why she doesn't and other women don't have access to polling places. Or groups of people like black people, black women specifically, who don't have access to voting places, who don't have equal access to education, who don't have a living wage. You have the Black Panther Party, who came on in the late 60s, early 70s, talking about not just Black Power and the Black Power movement, but creating living wages, maintaining free breakfast programs for students in Oakland, creating what we now know as Title I, and creating free and reduced lunch. You have different organizations that were looking at how to undo systemic social injustice in a unified manner.
Perhaps one of the most important things that was happening in that time is you had 5 judges on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that were some of the most radical, brave people willing to step out and take stands for civil rights behind the scenes. Now, I'm not talking about district judges. I'm talking about at the Fifth Circuit, a circuit now that's been loaded up, of course, with conservative judges. But those judges literally set up injunctions that had never been set up in English or American law, whereby the Attorney General and civil rights lawyers could go directly to an appellate court to do things like the march that happened from the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And they were the ones that were going to hold Ross Barnett guilty of contempt. And they worked on that part of putting the governor of Mississippi in jail for contempt of court for the very thing you showed up there on the thing. So behind the scenes, you had this miracle of these judges that were appointed by no less than Dwight Eisenhower, who turned out to be extraordinary angels that backed up all of this. And people think that the Supreme Court was the place where all of the civil rights happened. If you really look, it was those 5 judges at the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans and one judge in Alabama by the name of Frank Johnson, who handled most of the integration in civil rights cases in the United States. That's more than I should have said, probably.
No, if you really look, the Fifth Circuit judges, what they did was actually built upon what Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner did after slavery. That's where it really started, with the 39th Congress, also called the Reconstruction Congress, because they were the Congress after the Civil War. So Thaddeus Stevens, being a Congress member, and Charles Sumner, being a senator, were actually talking about not just the abolition of slavery and the granting of civil rights, but those 2 gentlemen were seen as radical Republicans of the time, who actually were talking about voting rights, equal access to all facilities, equal access to everything, and sheer equality. So while the gentleman in the back is correct about the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and filing claims with the appellate court, what they did would not have been possible without the 39th Congress members, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens.
One thing that should be pointed out is most of what Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner did was erased by the Supreme Court in the 1870s and 1890s. Where they literally said that civil rights did not apply to black people, they applied to corporations. You can find a whole body of case law that completely obliterates any of those rights, starting with the slaughterhouse case.
Of course, the slaughterhouse case, but that was actually dependent upon Bingham of Ohio, who was also a Congress member in the 39th Congress. It was not Charles Sumner or Thaddeus Stevens. It was Bingham, because Bingham is the one who actually proposed the 14th Amendment. Yeah. So I like our ping pong match of Bingham and all the gentlemen that you mentioned, I mentioned. Bingham really was the one, while we talk about Charles Sumner, and to me Charles Sumner was way more radical and objective and looking at things from a broad scope of how can we bring about equality for all people than Thaddeus Stevens, because Charles Sumner had a bit more freedom in the Senate. You have Bingham of Ohio, who actually proposed the original 14th Amendment, which the 14th Amendment is the is a citizenship amendment in the Constitution. So it's citizenship, life, liberty, and life, liberty, property, and due process. A lot of times when you sue, especially if you're like a school teacher, school districts want to make sure you have due process of law, that you have equal access to the laws, you have time to get counsel, things like that. That's the 14th Amendment. All of the Supreme Court decisions and all of the civil rights decisions that were argued in the court that were decided during the civil rights movement, 9 times out of 10, and I mean like 99% of the time, all of those decisions go back to the 14th Amendment. The issue with the 14th Amendment not just being the citizenship amendment is about that equal protection. Those words are echoed in a lot of civil rights litigation, equal protection, because equal protection is a synonym for equal access. But we know equal access is still not really equal. So during the early 60s, you have a lot of revolts, a lot of movements, not just in the Deep South, but you have different things going on in Detroit, in Chicago, in the Southwest. And so while the lady back here was saying that, it's surprising that Kennedy was not talking about Black life and humanity, but really just talking about it's our job to just enforce the law. You see that rhetoric repeated, not just from the Oval Office, but from city officials, state legislators. And the rhetoric is very nuanced and it's very, very subconscious of, let's just maintain peace and law and order. We don't want to ruffle feathers and cause further protests, but we're still not going to grant equal access of opportunity. The rhetoric was repeated in Dallas. You can YouTube videos called Dallas at the Crossroads, where the same language was used, law and order. This is a city of law and order. But it was not about desegregating and meaning it. So with Bloody Sunday happening and other revolts, other protests, people losing their life, and violence looking very bad internationally for America, then you have President Kennedy giving this speech on primetime television. So I'm just going to play a clip of Kennedy's speech. And this is the only sitting president that we have had that has talked in a very, very explicit manner about what Black life means and does not mean in American society.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of 2 clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students of the University of Alabama, who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about 1/2 as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much chance of completing college. 1/3 as much chance of becoming a professional man. Twice as much chance of becoming unemployed. About 1/7 as much chance of earning $10,000 a year. A life expectancy which is 7 years shorter, and the prospects of earning only half as much. This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives. It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act.
So you hear President John F. Kennedy talking about the moral issue of society, that there was too much violence going on to ignore it. We could not ignore it in our court system. We could not ignore it in society any longer because there was too much violence. It was televised, and therefore there was a moral issue. President Kennedy also talked about disparity between black and white people. A child could be born in the same place, the same city, not necessarily the same hospital because there were a lot of white-only hospitals, but black children still did not have the same access to opportunity as white children. We still see that today. So you have organizations like Snick who are photographing what's going on, who are going to meetings to practice being vilified, to practice being oppressed so that they will not strike back, so that they will remain nonviolent direct action protesters. And with that, you have litigation that's starting. You have the president on national TV talking about inequity. And you have the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a direct response to this social activism that you see. The Civil Rights Act is what desegregated public spaces in America. Spaces that get federal monies, those spaces were desegregated under that legislation. You have Fannie Lou Hamer, who's arguing in Congress about the poor opportunity of people to vote who were black in Mississippi, the opportunity that was essentially non-existent. People arguing about no living wages for black people, no access to schooling. And so some of those same "am I not a man and a brother" was created again, recreated and just modified to "I am a man," which is still arguing for the basic acknowledgement of humanity, of a person's well-being, of a person's livelihood. So you were right when you were talking about the workers, the sanitation workers strike, that "I am a man" was dating back to slavery. And that's still current today with Black Lives Matter. The enunciation of that is a declarative. Black Lives Matter. It's not a question. It is a telling that black lives do matter because the argument is that I am a human. I am a person. Therefore, my life matters. It is about anti-lynching, which is police brutality. It is about people murdering black lives because they are seen as a threat just because of the melanin in their skin. They are seen as hostile. They are seen as angry. They are seen as a person who is weaponized just because they are black. So when you have Black Lives Matter and what lives matter and what lives don't, it's not about arguing that, well, blue lives matter, because overwhelmingly those blue lives are still white. Overwhelmingly, the people who say all lives matter are usually white people who say all lives matter, because all lives essentially do matter. But the argument is that black life has been seen as being valueless for so long that you have to articulate that black lives actually do matter. And so at this time, I'm going to show the very last video. I want you to keep in mind President Kennedy's speech and then listen to the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, Marion Wright Edelman, the first black woman licensed attorney in Mississippi, who not only founded the Children's Defense Fund, but helped to pioneer the Poor People's Movement, Poor People's Campaign, and was an advisor to Dr. King.
For a TV, the world is thinking. Well, imagine God visiting our very wealthy family blessed with 6 children. 5 of them have enough to eat and comfortable rooms in which to sleep. One does not. She's often hungry and cold, and on some nights she has to sleep on the streets or in a shelter, or even be taken away from her neglectful family and placed in foster care or group homes with strangers. Imagine this rich family giving 5 of its children nourishing meals 3 times a day, snacks to fuel boundless energy, but sending the 6th child from the table into school hungry, with only 1 or 2 meals and never the dessert the other children enjoy. Imagine this very wealthy family making sure 5 of its children get all their shots, regular health checkups before they get sick, and immediate access to health care when illness strikes, but ignoring the 6th child, who is plagued by chronic respiratory infections and painful toothaches which sometimes abscess and kill for lack of a doctor or a dentist. Imagine this family sending 5 of their children to good, stimulating preschools and making sure they have music and swimming lessons after school, but sending the 6th child to unsafe daycare with untrained caregivers responsible for too many children, or leaving her occasionally with an accommodating relative or neighbor or oldest sibling, or even all alone. Imagine 5 of the children living in homes with books and families able to read to most of their children every night, but leaving the other child unread to, untalked and unsung to, unhugged or propped before a television screen or a video game that feeds him violence and sex and racially and gender-charged messages, intellectual pablum, interrupted only by ceaseless ads for material things beyond the child's grasp. Imagine this family sending some of their children to high-quality schools in safe neighborhoods with enough books and computers and laboratories and science equipment and well-prepared teachers, and sending the 6th child to a crumbling school building with peeling ceilings and leaks and lead in the paint and asbestos, and old books and not enough of them, and teachers untrained in the subjects they teach and with low expectations that all children can learn, especially the 6th child. Imagine most of the family's children being excited about learning and looking forward to finishing high school, going to college, and getting a job, and the 6th child falling further and further behind grade level, not being able to read, wanting to drop out of school, and being suspended and expelled at younger and younger ages because no one has taught him to read and compute or diagnosed his attention deficit disorder or treated his health and mental health problems and helped him keep up with his peers. Imagine 5 of the children engaged in sports and music and arts, and after school and summer programs and camps and enrichment efforts, and the 6th child hanging out with peers or going home alone because mom and dad are working or are in prison or have run away from their parenting responsibilities and escaped in drugs and alcohol, leaving him alone or on the streets during idle non-school hours and weeks and months, at risk of being sucked into illegal activities and the prison pipeline or killed in our gun-saturated nation. Well, this is our American family today, where 1 in 6 of all of our children lives in poverty, in the richest nation on earth, more than 40% in extreme poverty, and we've had an increase of 200,000 children in extreme poverty over the last year, and that was before this economic downturn. It is not a stable, healthy, economically sensible, or just family. Our failure to invest in all of our children before they get sick or drop out of school and get into trouble is morally indefensible and extremely costly. Every year we let 13 million children live in poverty, costs $500 billion in lost productivity and the cost of crime and health denial. You cannot hurt others, especially children, without consequences. And contrary to popular stereotypes, America's 6th child is more than twice as likely to live in a working family than to be on welfare, is more likely to be white than black or Latina, and is more likely to live in a rural or suburban area than in an inner city. But black and Hispanic children are at far greater risk of being poor and of entering the cradle to prison pipeline.
So that was roughly 10 years ago. Not much has changed in 10 years. Cities like Dallas, one of the wealthiest cities in this state, has children in poverty at a rate of 1 in 4, not 1 in 6. You have what's about to be a new recession and a new economic downturn. And you still have disparities between black children and white children, black communities and white communities. When I said at the beginning of this talk that black people are technically not free, what I meant was that if you look at civil rights legislation, primarily the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you have Congress people granting permission to black people to allow them access to equal accommodations, to allow them access to desegregated spaces. But acts are what are permanent. Acts are permanent. You have amendments that are, acts are temporary, amendments are permanent. So with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, they are temporary bandages to a problem. That is why you have Congress people who have to re-vote to continue granting black people permission to have access to public accommodations, granting black people permission to have freedom of voting without or with minimal racial violence and racial tension or voter oppression, voter purging from ballots. It is a permission because acts are temporary. Amendments are what are permanent. And that is why black people as a race still are not technically free, are not legally free, because our federal government has granted temporary provisions in order to grant that freedom. Thank you. I'll take any questions that you all may have. Sorry.
You said that it all came down to power and control.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading back in the 70s, a feminist wrote something about the black woman gets the double whammy because first she's discriminated against because she's black, and then because she's a woman. And I think that's very true. What worries me is that I am a proud member of the local NAACP, but there are a number of members who belong to churches that tell women that God is the head of man and man is the head of woman, that wives should be submissive to their husband. To me, this is hypocritical. I mean, that's got to change.
Did you have a question?
No, I just want to
No,
say
that's
that.
fine. That's fine. I get it.
I got a comment. You said that slaves weren't free, and you said that slaves in Texas weren't free until 1867. It was on June 19th, 1865, that General Gordon Granger read the Emancipation Proclamation in Galveston. Blacks in Texas have celebrated Juneteenth ever since.
So that's not true. That's not true. Black have soldiers coming down and freeing them from enslavement for 2 to 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was delivered. And it was delivered twice. It was delivered in 1863 by Lincoln, and then that did nothing. So it was delivered again in 64.
Another thing, we've had black people who have literally risen from slavery to wealthy. Back in the 1880s, there was a man named by the name of Daniel Webster Wallace, who was born a slave, but by the 1890s he was a wealthy cattleman, and he had white friends who helped him get along. He went on trail drives and got experience in the cattle business, and he owned his own ranch down in Mitchell County in the 1880s and 90s. In fact, Ranching Heritage Center out here has his home.
Yeah, so that's what you would call an outlier. There's actually a fantastic book called Black Fortunes, which is about the first 4 black millionaires post-slavery. They were formerly enslaved. But 4 people do not discount the millions of people who were actually enslaved and did not become millionaires post-slavery. So therefore, they are outliers because they are the exception to the rule. You have the immediate creation of sharecropping, where people were formerly enslaved, living on their slave master's plantation, cropping all of their food for them, being highly skilled and trained, doing everything for them because they were forced labor, seen as property, not as humans. Then there's living on the former slave owners' land as sharecroppers, and because they were sharecroppers, they were always indebted to their slave masters because they had to lease the land in order to crop their crops. They had to give part of their crops to their former slave master. They had to pay with credit that was through the slave master's credit to even get the tools to crop. So they were always in debt to their slave master, never actually breaking even, let alone getting ahead. So you have people who were formerly enslaved being sharecroppers. Then you have the immediate creation of convent leasing. That was thanks to the 13th Amendment that actually freed slave people. So the 13th Amendment, while it freed the formerly enslaved, it actually created, through the language of the 13th Amendment, convent leasing and this imperfect criminal justice system we see today. That is why it disproportionately victimizes and vilifies black and brown bodies, particularly black bodies, because it's embedded in the 13th Amendment, which is another piece of evidence that actually argues against the freedom black people have, because black people are only temporarily free because of all the legality and the nuances of American democracy. So you have all of those different things, and that's why you have the 1 or 2 or the 4 formerly enslaved black millionaires, because of the nuanced language and the institutional biases and oppression that was created to maintain status quo. I'm going to take this gentleman in the back since he hasn't asked any questions.
The Civil Rights Act was 1964, and then we came back in 65 had the Voting Rights Act. What was it about the Civil Rights Act that did not cover voting rights? To me, that alludes back to what you have been talking about with the 13th and 14th Amendment, and how come civil rights didn't cover everything?
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not cover everything because persons in Congress stripped language out. It's the same thing that happened post-slavery with the Reconstruction Congress, the 39th Congress. The congressmen like Bingham from Ohio, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens were arguing for uninhibited equal access, equal protection, equality in society and all of its infrastructures. But other Congress people stripped it out. So because those proposals were presented and they were not passed, they were modified. And so you have the original version of the 14th Amendment that actually was going to create a more equal playing field, and the language was stripped out. The same thing happened a century later in the Civil Rights Movement with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The language was stripped out. And because it wasn't enough, you have social activists who stayed in the streets arguing for voting rights. If we have access to public accommodations now, why can't we still vote? This does not make sense, because technically, black men could have the right to vote because of the 15th Amendment, 1870. Black women technically had the right to vote because of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But because of barriers like literacy tests, grandfather clauses, constitution tests, poll taxes, black people as a group really did not have voting power. There was no voting bloc because of those systemic institutional barriers. So with the Civil Rights Act not talking about voting rights, that's why you have the Voting Rights Act of 65. That's why you have the Fair Housing Act, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1968, that was created in order to rectify the generations worth of damage created by racial covenant housing, racial ordinances. Cities like Lubbock had racial ordinances, of residential ordinances. Cities like Dallas had residential ordinances because the state of Texas was a legally segregated state. So I'm a Dallas native, which is why I always rely on Dallas. I wrote a whole book on the civil rights movement in Dallas. And in Dallas with racial covenants, it was literally a cross that was drew. One section was wealthy, well-to-do white people. One section was poor white people. One section was all black people, and then one section was called the Barrio, which was Tejano people, Mexican-American people primarily. And so you have all of that, which is why black people in Dallas legally had to stay at the bottom of the Trinity River because there was nowhere else for them to go. And so you have legislation like the Fair Housing Civil Rights Act of '68 that was created in order to ameliorate some of that systemic oppression, which is why, again, you have Voting Rights Act of '65, because the Civil Rights Act only desegregated public spaces. That was it.
Question, a little bit of a change of pace. Did you ever get a chance to study the Rosenwald schools?
The Rosenwald schools are fantastic. There's a really great book. Rosenwald schools, if you don't know, are all black schools that were created to educate black persons who either were free black, meaning they were never enslaved, their descendants were never enslaved, or freed people who were formerly enslaved. Rosenwald schools were on the East Coast primarily. The best book that really encompasses the achievement of black people, I'm trying not to use the title in what I'm saying, is Their Highest Potential, is by Vanessa Siddle Walker. And that book talks about what happened in the Rosenwald schools, how black students achieved great heights. And the schools were not everywhere. And so you see educational injustice taking place in states like Texas because, again, a lot of black Texans did not have access to high schools. So when you hear language like the achievement gap, you really can't call it an achievement gap if access to opportunity was never essentially there. So that's why people like Gloria Lansing-Billings coined the phrase the education debt. Because in the 70s, that's when you actually see the achievement gap narrowing because you have post-Brown, and you know now everyone supposedly has access to the same opportunities in public schooling. So you see this achievement gap narrowing. It's since started widening after the 70s. But with the 70s, that's when you actually have a lot of black people who have finally access to high school. And so that's why that gap started to narrow. But the Rosenwald schools were really the exception to everything because you have black people getting access to education, going off to high school, going to college because of schools like that. Thank you.
Dr. Parker, thank you so much for giving this exciting lecture tonight. We appreciate it very much. And I'm sure she'll take your questions if you'd like to talk to her. We have some evaluations on the back table back there. If you'd just take a second to fill them out, they're real short and sweet. And please help yourself to whatever's left back there. I hate to take food upstairs. Thank y'all for coming.